Today's forum, Police Body Cameras Benefits and Challenges Part 2, is a continuation of an important discussion we began last month. Both of these forums are sponsored by Event Marketing Strategies. Won't you please help me thank them and welcome President and Founder Jeff Milgram to the stage to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Mindy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be back for round two of what promises to be an important discussion today. But before we meet our speakers, I'd like to just take a moment to introduce some fellow board members of Central Ohio Crime Stoppers who are sitting at our table over here. Three guys who volunteer their time and expertise to help keep the bad guys off the street. I'd like to introduce Mr. Mike Puskas, Vice President of Crime Stoppers, Dave Kuzma, Treasurer, and Mr. Norm Brusk, Secretary. Gentlemen, thank you very much for all you do for Crime Stoppers and for the community. At Event Marketing Strategies, safety is a very important issue to all of us. That's why we're pleased to support the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Club to meet and engage in meaningful discussion on topics important to the Central Ohio community. Today, we are once again bringing together important individuals who will have an impact on that ultimate decision. Please welcome in the middle, partner at Crabbe, Brown & James, Mr. Larry James. Larry, thank you for being here. To my immediate right, Mr. Dennis Hetzal. Dennis is the Executive Director of the Ohio Newspaper Association. Dennis, thank you. And our host today, reporter for the Statehouse News Bureau, Mr. Andy Chow. Andy, please welcome all of our speakers. Andy, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and thanks to the Columbus Metropolitan Club for having us here today to talk about a really important topic. I want to start off by doing a little exercise. So take yourself back maybe 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, and imagine yourself watching TV, listening to the radio, reading a newspaper, and you see a news story about a high-profile police altercation. And you start to tell yourself, I wish there was video of this. What if there were cameras there to get the full situation, to tell the full story? It's too bad that we don't have that. It's too bad that we couldn't just have everybody holding a camera at all times to really tell us the story of, was there brutality? Was it excessive force? Was it the right thing to do? In the past, this might have been something that would seem unimaginable, but now that's a very real possibility. We live in a world where this can actually happen, where every police officer could wear a body camera. But that means we actually have to face the reality of such an idea, to face the complex questions that come with putting cameras on our peace officers. During the first part of the Columbus Metropolitan Club's forum on body cameras, we heard about the different policies and procedures that the city's looking at to achieve this goal. Today, we want to focus on three main issues. Privacy. We're not going to talk about national security today. You guys are off the hook on that. I practiced this so many times that for some reason national security kept coming into my head. I was like, that's nothing to do with today. Privacy, public records, and technology. So we have, as we said, Larry and Dennis here to talk about those things. So let's start with Larry. Both of you, go ahead and introduce yourselves a little bit more and talk about what brings you here? And then I want you to answer this first question, which is, why are body cameras important to have? And we can start with Larry.
Quick background, I've been General Counsel to the National Fraternal Order of Police since '01. So we've been around the country dealing with a lot of the situations that have occurred. Also from '89 to '92, I was Safety Director over Police and Fire in Columbus under Mayor Reinhardt. Dennis.
Yeah, I'm Dennis Hetzal, Executive Director of the Ohio Newspaper Association. I was going to say, I know more about national security than the generals, so I'm sorry. So I'll just pontificate about that. So I couldn't resist. My background's in the newspaper industry. I've been an editor, including a police reporter for a while, and a courts reporter, an editor, a publisher, a general manager. I worked at the Cincinnati Enquirer before I took this job in 2010. Now I'm a registered lobbyist, so the body camera issue is one that we know is very significant for open records and the public's right to know, so we've tried to take a deep dive into that.
And to start out, Andy, to try to answer your question, I think Columbus has approached this situation the right way. They've had a number of months, diverse team that have looked at a policy, but this situation goes back almost 3 years, and one of the early reports came out from the Department of Justice, and that report was entitled Implementing Body-Worn Camera Program Recommendations and Lessons Learned. But the thing that always comes to mind is not the police situation, it is the right to privacy or the expectation of privacy. So if you're at the drive-in and you happen to be doing something you shouldn't be doing and an officer walks up, that is going to be recorded. It's going to be a public record. The question we ask ourselves, in our homes, is there any privacy? And if an officer walks in on a domestic call or a 911 call and happens to see a child or a spouse or a juvenile in a situation and that's recorded on camera, what are my rights as a private citizen? Because I can assure you, those are the situations that are going to hit home to us as private citizens more than the confrontation that occurs in a police-citizen encounter or the press request for the disclosure of those information. So what do you do if an officer is in your home and there is something that you find offensive or you believe to be within your private rights? Those are the issues that we will lack clarity on. On the normal public records process, we have seen an evolution from the idea of the public officials who had the pagers, who had the cell phones, who have the tablets. What is that right of expectation of a public official, including a police officer, including the body camera, just like the dashboard camera? And those are pretty clear. There isn't going to be a lot of gray. There may be a heated dispute. There may be timing of when that is to be released. But the truth of the matter is, you as a private citizen, when you encounter that officer, and clearly outside the home you don't have any expectation or right of privacy, but in your home and other situations, whether you're in your building, your office, things of that sort. I think that's going to be the real challenge for us as we evolve.
Our legislative goal, as we've been, talking to legislators, because I do think it's inevitable that the state legislature is going to take a look at this and probably do make some specific changes to our open records law, because these do raise a lot of issues. And what we don't want to see happen, and some states have done this, unfortunately, is to make all this footage presumptively closed and then only released at the discretion of the government, because we think that would defeat the goals of accountability and transparency, which obviously are two of the main reasons we're even having these discussions about whether police should use them and how they should deploy them. And the point we try to make that government, and people forget this sometimes, I think, government is the custodian of public records, not the owner of public records. You're the owner of the records. And records should be presumptively open. They're public records. And that should attach to this footage just as it does to everything else under the Ohio Revised Code. And also that we already have, with the latest changes coming into effect, we're going to be up to exemption DD in the open records law, which means we've run out of single letters. So we have 30 enumerated exemptions already to the open records law, and hundreds more scattered through the code. And a lot of these situations that we need to talk about, and we'll be talking about, actually are not unique. They're unusual, they're novel in some cases, but they're not unique. There's a lot of case law, and a lot of these exemptions that we already have are going to cover some of these situations. And the final thing we've been saying is that if we do need to get in the code, and I agree that we do, because these do raise some interesting circumstances, like when does my expectation of privacy in my home trump, overcome the public's right to know? Because there's going to be times when that video in that home is very much in the public interest. And so any exemptions we craft should be as narrowly drawn as possible. And I'll give you just a real quick example. There's a new law that the governor has signed to protect domestic violence victims. And it's a good law. It's to protect domestic violence victims from their stalkers using public records to find out where they're living. Now, who could be against that? We certainly aren't. I mean, that's a good idea. They'll have an anonymous P.O. box that the Secretary of State's office will take for their mail and forward it to them, et cetera. But the original draft of the bill, the language was so broad that it would have been impossible to scrutinize the program itself. In other words, even aggregated data about how many people are in the program. Is it working? What's it costing? So we worked with all the parties involved to narrow the language that it protects the people it intends to protect, and it will. It's good language, but yet still allows the public and the media, journalists to, and anybody, other citizen groups, to look at how the program is operating. And that's the kind of thoughtful approach I think we have to take to any new exemptions to the code related to body-worn cameras.
And Dennis, so you brought up a good example about privacy and what happens if this is something that came up in the first part, which is former Ohio Supreme Court Justice Andy Douglas described the scenario where a police officer went to somebody's home, and when somebody opened the door, a woman was standing inside the living room in her underwear, and he said, should that end up on the 6 o'clock news? Well, I guess to me, I would think that it could be up to a journalist to decide, well, we don't need to show that. Where does the press and what is the responsibility of journalists to decide privacy?
Well, you know, it is situational, and and the question that always comes up, and I hear this a lot from legislators, is they're not so much worried about what Channel 4 is going to do with it, or the Dispatch, or even national traditional media outlets are going to do. It's the random blogger, it's TMZ, it's this, and I don't know how we unring that bell, or how we put so many restrictions around that to where government basically can't be playing editor or news director in deciding what can be released and what's not. And it's a true dilemma. What I would like to see happen, and some states have done this, is have some type of ability to petition a court that the public interest outweighs the need for secrecy in the case of, say, a privacy situation like that.
Andy, let me follow up on that. I think Dennis is absolutely correct. I'm not sure the law, case law, or statutory law is going to be much assistant to the public at large on that hypothetical that you have just given. That will end up on someone's video, period.
There's no way of stopping that.
You would have to go to court, but the timing of that is almost impossible, and it's cost prohibitive for most of the public to be able to avail themselves of the lawyers and the legal system to stop that. So it's just not going to be. And that's why I said that privacy issue that we all look at is where the fight and the whole debate is really going to come down to. And if you just say from the standpoint of juveniles, who it will be a class or a group that's going to be protected, even in that situation, we're going to have our strains.
Can you two talk a little bit more about these media outlets that, like you said, they're not the major TV networks, they're not NPR, but there's other groups out there that are sort of aggregates for this kind of content? Are there groups out there that just will collect everything and put it onto something like YouTube?
Oh, there's YouTube channels now, I think this was referenced in the last meeting, that just take all the police video that they can get and just, put it up there. And again, no responsible media outlet would do that, but then, different generations, different people have different definitions of responsibility and different senses of personal privacy. I think millennials, for example, don't seem generally, this is probably a terrible generalization, but don't seem generally as hung up about personal privacy as the older generation is. So their values and what their expectations about personal privacy, may be different and not as big a deal as it is to some older people. But these are all things we're going to have to work through.
And Andy, one follow-up to the last forum. 2 years ago, the National FOP came up with a best policy relative to body cameras, and they always ask, is the police for or against body cameras? We have come out and said they are here to stay. We want the best policies and practice. Officers just need to know the rules by which they are going to come up to bat with. And as long as those officers have those, they'll figure it out. Just put the guidelines in place, make sure they're thoughtful, but it's not the officers who drive this. I go back to a situation where when I was safety director, we had our first EMS person that had been diagnosed with HIV. And I remember Buck Reinhardt, it was Friday, 3 o'clock, and he said, look, you need to deal with this. And I said, Mayor, I'm not sure what we want to do. We need to convene the health professionals and everyone. He said, Larry, here's the deal. I'm holding a press conference at 9 o'clock on Monday. Either you give me your best product Monday morning or I'll make it up and you'll defend it. Now, the reality of that, he said, Larry, we will not, have the bureaucracy impede our progress in addressing these issues. And I think what we're seeing, if we can have better statewide as opposed to, different jurisdiction having different policies, it's going to help us, it's going to help the community, it clearly is going to help police officers as to the guidance that they need to carry out their day-to-day duties and when to turn it on, when to turn it off, and what editing or redacting is to do.
And if I can just, maybe follow up on that a little bit. One of the dilemma here with some of this stuff, to the earlier question, Andy's earlier question, is a fundamental premise of any good open records law is the requester should not have to state a purpose or a reason for wanting to see the record. And if you think it through related to police records, for example, the reasons are kind of obvious. It actually can be intimidating or a really bad idea to let whoever you're asking for the record to know why you want to see it. You can disclose that, but you can't be required to disclose that. And so the purpose or the use of the public record is something the government has always kind of been, walled off from looking at. And I think what may happen, you look at this Hulk Hogan case, where there's no legitimate purpose for what Gawker did with Hulk Hogan, putting up video of Hulk Hogan and his former friend's ex-wife having sex. And now Gawker is being sued and has been sued basically into bankruptcy. And it's a dilemma for media organizations because the other thing that's happened here is a rich Silicon Valley guy, investor with a bone to pick with the media for the way he's been covered, in some cases rightfully so, is bankrolling Hulk Hogan in this case. So do you support Gawker even though, as a media organization, even though you know what they did was scurrilous, or do you just say, hey, that's tough, you're kind of getting what you deserve, and now we've opened up the door to, again, the wealthiest people being able to bankroll litigation they have otherwise have no interest in order to bring down media outlets, which is a very real threat in our society if that premise is allowed to stand. So there'll probably be some emerging law, I would think, at some point, even with public records, that certain uses are going to be so offensive to people that whether it gets into privacy law or other areas beyond open records, that there probably will ultimately be some limitations on it. But it's hard to predict just how that will go.
So if anybody had Hulk Hogan on their Columbus Metropolitan bingo card, you can check off Hulk Hogan there. Larry, you talked about best practices nationwide. There are all sorts of local municipalities, there are all sorts of groups creating these best practices. Have you ever heard of any practice that the national FOP is very much against? Is there any procedure out there or policy out there that can actually hurt police and stop them from doing their jobs?
I'm going to answer the question this way. During the tenure as safety director, the class of officers that I always went to for clarity on policy were the commanders. That group, that bridge between upper-level command and the street officers. And I just used them as my barometer, and I think it made my job a heck of a lot easier. I can't think of a policy specific that says, this is a bad idea. I think where you have multi-jurisdiction and mutual aid agreements and different policy complicates the officer's life painfully. So I would simply say that where you have, like in Franklin County, mutual aid, and whether that's police or fire, whatever those policies, procedures are, just try to make them consistent.
Dennis, what concerns does the Ohio Newspaper Association have as far as when cameras are turned on and off? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
You know, as a general proposition, I mean, I certainly can envision circumstances, you know, having been a reporter where I would hope the department's policy is that the camera should be on in that, but I'm not sure that it's our discussion to have about what policy the local police department, even the statute, should say about when officers should have the cameras activated. But it's our position, once you've activated that camera, in all but maybe some oddball circumstances, maybe not even then, you know, these are going to be public records under the revised code, and once they're public records, they're presumptively open and should be, you know, discoverable with, you know, the reasonable exemptions that we have or will have to create.
And see, the real world complicates that issue. Let's assume the officer's talking to an informant, and obviously that confidentiality comes into question. Those are the type of real-life situations that you're determining. Here in Columbus, we just saw a situation involving plainclothes detectives and whether they are going to be required to wear and who wears that body camera. All of those things have to be vetted out. And I would just say that I sincerely do believe the way this, at least in Columbus, is being approached, it is the right way. And I think when it's said and done, we're going to have one of the leading best practice policies in the country.
I'd agree with that. I've been involved in the Columbus procedures and have even presented to their working group. It's been a great, thoughtful process. I've learned an awful lot doing it. I was talking to George Speaks, who was here a couple weeks ago, about some of these issues, and you know, there's already an exemption in the code for records that would reveal a confidential informant. And George raised the issue of, well, not everybody meets the technical legal definition of a confidential informant. What if the officer is investigating and there's someone who really wants to help the police, isn't actually you know, you would be able to explain this better than I could. It meets the definition of a CI, but certainly would have some fear of safety if they could be seen, you know, and told, not redacted, blurred, or changed in any way, you know, talking to the officer or trying to help the police. And, you know, that's a good point. And, you know, again, if we all get in a room and start looking at language, I think it would be irresponsible of us not to concede that that's a good point, and we need to figure out how to protect people that are trying to help the police and would have a legitimate fear for their safety.
I have an iPhone 6 right here, which to me is just a really great piece of technology, but in 3 years I'm going to think that this is a worthless paperweight. So what happens when we give cameras to all the police officers, but then 3 years from now there's going to be a much bigger, better camera out there that would do just a lot better things? What is it the responsibility of the city to constantly upgrade their software, to constantly upgrade their devices and technology?
Absolutely, and I think when you look at the capital budget, that's the way normally those upgrades are financed. Again, you know, we saw law enforcement communications, whether we were talking about the 800 megahertz system or what have you, and how your safety forces communicate. And, you know, we'll find a way to finance it because you have to.
I've made a couple points to legislators about this. One is I worry about the nomenclature body-worn cameras if it gets into statute because, to your point, we could be talking about tiny little drones flying over their shoulders in a couple years, or I mean, who knows? There's already weapon cameras that fit on the end of the barrel of your weapon. It's not just going to be a body-worn camera, and we don't want to have, you know, language that talks about 8-track tape decks in a digital world. And most of the language drafts I see specifically refer to body-worn cameras, and I think we ought to be a little more expansive in how we look at this, or we're going to be back in the room again trying to fix whatever it is we do. The other thing, I think there's a real opportunity here to do things right. This is more with my policy wonk hat on than open records, but you know, I think the concerns the police have about the time it's going to take to review this, redact it, not just for the media, but for prosecutors preparing it, is legitimate. Technology is going to make that easier. But Columbus, for example, is going to develop world-class expertise in managing this content. The local township police department or a tiny sheriff's office in a rural county is going to have one officer who maybe knows how to do it occasionally. And why can't we centralize and regionalize these services so that stuff can be handled in a meaningful and responsible manner and in a uniform manner, to Larry's point, so it's easier for everybody to manage these thousands of terabytes of content that are going to be stored, archived, and accessed.
Is a timely release something that you're concerned about? Are there hurdles that can stand in the way of releasing video like this in a timely fashion that don't stand in the way of just an actual paper document?
Well, Andy Douglas was here, who argued the case in the Supreme Court last week, and the two cases, one involved, both were brought by the Cincinnati Enquirer. One had to do with a chase up 71, and the other one had to do with the shooting in Cincinnati. In the Cincinnati shooting, that tape was released in about 8 days, if not earlier. So I think the law has always been a reasonable time. The question is, when you get into the exemptions about the ongoing criminal investigation, so when is that triggered? In the drive up 71, was it when the officer started following the vehicle and turned on the sirens and the video camera roll, or was it when they came to a stop to do the interrogation? We believe that it's an ongoing inquiry, so when you're following someone, whether it's a potential OMVI or you begin to question, that is when that exemption takes place. And so at the conclusion of that, then it is a reasonable time period. Is that 8 days? Is that 14 days? Is it going to a single grand jury? Is it going to multiple grand jury? Does it involve one officer? Does it involve 10 officers, like the shooting in Cleveland? So I just think you have to look at it, and I think the press gets this. I think sometimes the pressure to go to print for the sensational trumps common sense. But I think the courts have consistently got it right for the most part, and I think that's where it's ultimately, when we fight against each other, we'll find that common ground.
The court's decisions in these two Cincinnati cases are going to be very impactful, no matter how you feel about it. I think it'll give a lot of guidance in terms of what the existing state law says on whether, one case is about dash cameras, the other is about body-worn cameras, about when they fall into the investigative records exemption and when they don't. And the Inquirer, the Cincinnati Enquirer, is arguing that these are not subject to investigative records exemption, which basically then puts them in an area where the release is discretionary to the government. They're not even required to release it if it falls into that exemption bucket. And again, regardless of it's two very interesting cases, and I think it's going to be helpful for everybody to see how the court rules on it.
But I think you have to keep in mind that probably 98% of video footage will probably be a non-issue. 98% or better will be a non-issue. And I think that if we look back in history at the public records law as it evolved, it has become predictable. And you'll recall when we first started out, because you filed a lawsuit, you could get attorney fees, and that became the chilling matter on government and public entities, because they were getting hit with attorney fees. And they said, oops, it's just too painful. So I think we're going to get there. I don't see this as a major issue, but I'm more positive and throughout my life in most things, but I think we're going to get it.
All right, in a few minutes, we're going to be moving on to audience questions. So if you have a question, start to line up around the mic there. But first, let me throw out one last question to you guys. I know it might seem pretty obvious or common sense, but can you describe some of the big differences that stand out between dash cam video and body cam video, maybe regarding policies or perspective?
I don't see a lot. I mean, obviously, when your dash cam, your car and wherever that camera's pointed, you have your limitations. Depending on your body camera, you have the same limitations that an officer's looking straight at the person. your peripheral vision and what's going over on your sides, those are the limitations of the technology as we speak. Is there going to be the development of an apparatus that can do the 360? We will get there. But I don't see a lot, and I don't think the law in the cases before the Supreme Court is one is dashboard cameras, the other one's body. On the issue of reasonableness, on the issue of when it becomes a public record, I think it's pretty much the same.
Where I do think there's a distinction is the dash cams are much less often, if ever, in a situation recording something where you would have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So that issue is pretty much off the table with dash cameras because they're generally recording things in public places, from the cruiser, on a public highway. The body cameras are going to be a lot more situations where the privacy issues are going to come into play. And then, to Larry's point, we have a lot of law and statute that deals with a lot of this already, and I do think we'll figure a lot of it out along the way.
Okay. Well, it's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Let's proceed with the first question. Carol.
Hi, I'm Carol Looper, and my question is about the on-off feature. In the cities where police are using the body cams, do they have discretion? Do they automatically turn them on and then cannot turn them off? Or do they have discretion and have problems arisen with an on-off feature on the body cams?
I can't answer that question, Carol. There are devices, so the policy is evolving. The different apparatuses are evolving. So whatever we contract to buy, that has to be consistent with the policy. When you get into that discretion, there's a lot of things that can be inferred, and I, for one, would not want to put our officers in that situation repeatedly.
One of the related issues with that, and it's a good question, on a lot of these things, should there be a statutory mandate that one size fits all for all police departments on you always have to have them activated in this type, in a shooting situation, whatever, or is this a department by department policy decision, in which case it won't be uniform? And that's something I think everybody's wrestling with on a lot of these issues.
And that was actually a question I wanted to get to. And Larry, what do you think about statewide uniform policies? Are those important to have, or is it important
I think they're very important. The thing about, you have to be careful about unfunded mandates in townships. I mean, we saw in the fire department where we were all uniform as to our ability to communicate. Those independent jurisdictions get very tough when you want to implement a uniform, and then do they have the ability to pay for it?
Next question.
Actually, Larry, that does the last couple words, pay for it, that leads into my question. So this was touched briefly on last session, and Dennis, you mentioned hundreds of terabytes of storage. One of the questions I had is how cost plays into this, because if you look at, like, the LAPD was doing 7,000 cameras with cloud-based storage, and it came out to $54 million a year to store the data. And, taxpayer money isn't infinite. So, LA kind of draw that back, and they're looking at on-premise storage to reduce the cost by about 60% or so, but still, if you compare that to how much we have, if we kept every video every day forever, you'd be spending, tens of millions of dollars a year, and that just isn't probably financially sustainable. So I guess, what's your thoughts on how that compares to, cost interacts with policy?
I wish the mayor and the council members Godspeed luck.
I do think, as an old editorial writer, I would be really concerned about unfunded mandates. And I've told a couple state legislators, if you're going to mandate this, you better find some money for the local governments to do it right. And as I said earlier, which will be great for journalists in terms of having access to a lot of this stuff if they're more ubiquitous and used more often. The storage issues are not inconsiderable. I mean, I think again, technology is constantly reducing the cost of this. And again, I think it's an opportunity. If everybody in a certain region of the state goes in for a uniform contract, I mean, we have Amazon building huge cloud computing centers here. If every individual little police department is negotiating their own contract, it's going to be far more expensive, and we're going to be back to where we used to be with police radios, where they couldn't talk to each other because everybody was doing their own thing. So I think there's a real opportunity here to we don't want the cost and difficulty of doing this be a reason to have more of these records secret or destroyed faster than they should be otherwise. That said, since 98% of this, I think Larry's right, it's not going to be needed to be kept for very long, but it's going to be needed to be kept for some period. And again, smart people should be able to get into a room and at least figure out how to keep the significant cost to a minimum, I think, in wise ways.
Okay, thank you. And actually, one quick comment on that or question. Do you think that 98% that's not in the public interest, it should still be public record?
Absolutely.
I'm Jane Scott. Because we were doing these forums, we were invited to see a demonstration of a particular company. And I was pretty impressed with the technology, frankly. I mean, it answered some of the questions that were in my mind about redaction. They had a pretty sophisticated redaction program that, for instance, the woman in her underwear could pretty easily be wiped out by putting those parameters in the software, in the cloud-based and all that. And the software even synced with the dash cam in terms of when the camera went on, when the officer got out of the car and things like that. I guess my question is, as I was sitting there thinking about that and going to this demonstration, I'm thinking, well, this is all really good and it could save the city a lot of money in the long run, perhaps, if we went with this kind of technology, but clearly this is going to be more expensive technology. So as the city is looking at the RFPs, is there a process in place to say, okay, this is so much more sophisticated technology, it's going to save us money in the long run, but this is the cheaper camera? I mean, as technology goes, it's going to be a pretty complex decision to make.
I think we're the wrong people to answer that question.
Okay.
One of the interesting things, and I learned this sitting in a lot of these Columbus sessions, the early and admittedly limited studies that have been done, there is some offset in that the departments that are utilizing these cameras find more cases are being settled without trial because it shows most of the time the cops doing their jobs correctly. And the defendants realize that, and the cases get disposed of faster. And complaints of police misconduct, which also are time-consuming and costly besides being very emotional for the community as well as the police, go down. So there's some offsets there. One thing that really struck me in the Columbus meetings I'd never thought about, I listened to an assistant district attorney talk about what she goes through just getting ready to show a DVD or a tape at a trial in the courthouse. You got to hustle looking for a TV, there's no Wi-Fi, and then now with all this tape, imagine how much tape, video was just recorded at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, for example, if they were all using cameras. The DA responsibly has to look at every frame and hours, and then just to show it, the hoops they have to jump through, at the courthouse just to find the technical equipment to do that. And these are all things we have to think about.
I think if you look at the status of dashboard cameras, this is a journey we've been through before. How do we finance? How do we maintain? All these issues we've been through before. We're better than we ever were before, and we're going to continue to get better. The ultimate financing of this is, are we going to body cam 75% of our police officers, our uniform officers, because there are certain large municipalities as we speak that probably 50% of their dashboard cameras are not working. Okay? So it is about resources, money, and financing. And so whatever the state does, whether it's an unfunded mandate or not, I think that implementation and the consolidation of communications within the safety forces is critical. And I think that's what the public should demand. So when you're dealing with your little township trustees who have the smaller departments and things of that sort, let's talk about that regional concept.
And just a quick follow-up, if I may. Body cameras have been around long enough. Is there any research that would indicate that it, I don't know how to say this gently, leads to better police behavior?
I don't know if you would say it leads to better police behavior. What I will say to you is that these apparatuses have served the safety forces much better. They have been vindicated and proven right more often than not. Because I think when you talk about police behavior, it depends on the zip code you're in as to the conduct. And having lived with this around the country, it's just a tough question to answer.
Hi, Warren Fishman. Thanks for coming. Maybe I misunderstood this, but we just talked about governing police behavior and also the behavior of the person the police interacts with. If they can turn them on and off and control that, what good are they?
I responded to that earlier. I said, I'm not sure we have a definitive answer, and I would be concerned about that because there's so many inferences, just as your question infers. So, but I think the policy will evolve. Let's hold judgment. Let's give them the opportunity to get it right.
Well, and we've also seen issues where there might be tampering with dash cam videos in the past. So is there a need for tougher laws when it comes to tampering with video, whether it's dash cam video, body cam video? Is that something that we need to readdress?
It's already a crime to alter public documents and the way you have. So if anyone who's a public person who alters, that's a crime. So we have that on the books. If you want to say, do we want to get tougher, then I'll leave that to the legislative branches.
Yeah, it's a matter of whether is that going to be in legislation or is that going to be, departmental policy. Another related question is, so I've got my camera going, I'm an officer, and the guy's, the person I'm talking to says, I'm going to talk to you unless you turn that camera off. So what discretion should the officer have? And I probably should have some to, say, okay, I'm deactivating the camera, and he obviously has to incorporate that in his written report. But how much discretion do you give to that officer for activating and not? Those are good questions.
Yes, my name is John McKnight. So most of what you're talking about, all these caveats around the use of the body cams, I think are probably to avoid litigation, to protect consumers' rights or the public's rights, but also avoid litigation. Is that preventing the body cams from going into use? Or is they going to go into use and we'll figure all this out as we go?
Well, I think the idea of body camera is to document a police officer's day-to-day activity. The benefit of that has been that in litigation or accusations against our safety forces, that video has served law enforcement very well. Now, if we want to get into the conduct, does it have a more chilling effect on bad behavior within law enforcement, or does it have a more chilling effect on the citizenry? Let me suggest to you, there are two videos I could run for you out of Ferguson. One infers that law enforcement personnel was the culprit. You look at another video that wasn't run by the media and you wonder why more people didn't die. So it just depends on the street angle you are on. But the bottom line is the public has called for documentation of police actions, and government is responding to that.
Mindy, one quick question. One more question, and it's kind of related, and it's the evolution of the technology. I'm not quite sure how to put this, but I guess the concept of policing by camera, and I know we already have neighborhoods and intersections where we have cameras, combine that with drone technology, and I'm really concerned and curious about the thoughts of rights to privacy in those situations. I wonder if you could comment on that.
The days of right to privacy on the streets and parks are long since gone. Give it up, forget it, move on.
Yeah, I kind of think that genie's out of the bottle. That if you are walking on a public street, certainly in any major city, with an expectation that somebody's not recording you, you're probably wrong.
Behave.
Well, and we, and we also have, there's pending legislation out there right now to let the public know that if you're in a public venue, if you're out in a public space, you are allowed to use your cell phone and record police altercations too. Now, we've seen video of that up in New York where police are saying you need to put your phone down. But if you're in a public space, you are allowed to record that. And there's legislation out there to sort of promote the use of those cameras as well. So even if the police officer doesn't have a body camera, you might have 5 other people with their cell phones out ready to go as well.
Now keep this in mind. When you do that, and there is a crime, it will be subpoenaed, it will be taken, it will become part of the evidence.
I also think, to the earlier point, it's really important for the media, and we could probably do a better job of reminding people, one video it's just another piece of content that helps provide context. It's not the be-all and end-all. I saw a demonstration where someone had a body-worn camera, and it looked like 2 people were fighting aggressively, and then the camera pulled back and they were breakdancing. I mean, and we have to do a better job and making sure that people understand that it's not necessarily definitive. This is what the camera saw, and if the officer's running, it's going to be shaky video. And you're getting a better picture than you got before. You're getting more information than you got before, but it's still limited at the end of the day and needs to be taken in context.
Sorry.
How you doing? My name is Jonathan Stewart. I had a question for Mr. James. Being the National FOP General Counsel, questions for you, Director, for you. When you have a police department like Cleveland that has body cameras, and they choose to not wear their body cameras for their convention, how do you feel about that? And they're doing it under the auspice of saying that their body cameras doesn't work on riot gear. If you can have cop-outs like that, then won't other departments do the same thing as well?
One thing I've learned, and this isn't to duck your answer, I need to get a better understanding of what they're doing. Cleveland happens to be one of those departments that financially is strapped and probably have a large number of their dash cams inoperative. And I know they've had some financial considerations. I would assume that the reason for not doing it, they don't have the financial capacity and the time to utilize those. That's what I'm going to assume.
Okay, thank you.
Let's try this again. Thank you all for participating in this, what I felt was a conversation that I learned a lot from. We encourage you to continue the conversation in the back of the room with coffee and cookies. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Please thank our sponsor, Event Marketing Strategies. And our speakers, Larry James, Dennis Hetzal, and Andy Chow. And thanks to all of you for being here. We look forward to seeing you here again.